Good evening. I'm Sister Catherine Ryan from Maryville Academy, and this evening our guest is Phil Andrew, who is the Director of Violence Prevention Initiatives from the Archdiocese of Chicago. You are watching Maryville Cares, a live, interactive television show on CAN TV 21. Also, we're streaming online at cantv.org/hotline. And in the next 25 minutes, we are going to learn more about violence prevention initiatives in the Chicago area through Phil. So, Phil, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, sister.
And please give us an idea, what does that mean, violence prevention initiatives? What's the scope of what you're involved in?
Well, when the Cardinal Cupich came to Chicago a few years ago, one of the things he noted right away was that we have a serious violence problem in Chicago. And while violent trends are actually going down in the country, there have been a few cities that have really had some sticky situations. And within those cities, some neighborhoods that have really, we've had kind of an entrenched problem with violence. So he wanted to make a concerted effort to sort of harness all things Catholic and figure out how we could triage to do more in those neighborhoods that were suffering from violence the most. The other piece of that is, what are we doing for parishes and schools to help keep them safe and build our capacity for conflict resolution and nonviolence?
And as a part of your mandate, Cardinal Cupich didn't want you only to work with Catholics, but he wanted Catholics to be engaged in the violence prevention. Would that be true?
That's exactly right. Nobody's going to be able to accomplish this alone. And I think you and our listeners probably know that we can't arrest our way out of this. No one group has the silver bullet. This is going to be an ecosystem of organizations working together, really highly coordinated, to address the whole spectrum of needs that folks have to keep them off a trajectory that leads to violence.
So, Phil, before we get into some of the work you're doing, I want our listeners to know what your background is and how it is that Cardinal Cupich found you.
Well, how the Cardinal found me is an interesting story, but I come to this as a survivor of violence. I was actually involved in one of the nation's first school shootings that took place up in Winnetka, Illinois. A deranged person went into a classroom and opened fire on 6 second graders, killing one. And in the course of that person's escape, they took my family and I hostage. I was just a 20-year-old college student at the time. But that I was shot in an attempt to disarm that person. And it was pretty formative in my life. And I've been involved in violence prevention ever since. But that led me to law school and eventually a 21-year career with the FBI, primarily working in violence prevention through crisis negotiation and crisis response, but also working violent crime and terrorism, many of the classifications that the FBI focuses on.
So Cardinal Cupich comes to you when?
Well, it started with the Cardinals' working group on violence prevention had asked me to give a presentation on social media and violence. And as you know, social media is now an important accelerator and echo and sometimes even an incubator of violence. Much of the violence we see today isn't about drugs or territory. A lot of it has to do with dignity and identity and things that are a little more emotional than actually physical safety. So I was presenting to them, and then they invited me back to answer some questions. And I think that just put me on the radar. I was not thinking of leaving the FBI. With 21 years, I still had a few good years, I think, in me. But it's very difficult to say no to a cardinal. And I think my mother would be very proud.
I'm sure she is. So, Phil, you come on to this work in Chicago, and who are some of the individuals or groups that you've met that you've been impressed with working in violence prevention?
Well, this is sort of a unsung story with regard to Chicago's violence prevention work. In 2019, we saw our sort of modern spike. Chicago saw unprecedented levels of violence that we hadn't seen really since the 80s and the 90s. And that was an anomaly when New York and LA's gun violence statistics were really being driven down to record lows. And so a lot of good folks came together, particularly in the philanthropic realm. Some of Chicago's great foundations, Chicago Community Trust, the Joyce Foundation, Polk Brothers, many, many others. In fact, about 30 to 40 different foundations, plus some of our corporate partners, came together and formed what's called CP4P, the Communities Partnering for Peace, and then the Partnership for a Safe and Peaceful Community. And together, those groups, think of it as a collaborative or an ecosystem of about 25 organizations, led primarily by Metropolitan Family Services, a longtime social service provider in Chicago, and the Heartland Alliance. They have subcontracts with a number of groups that are implementing really a comprehensive strategy. And that strategy basically comes down to the 19 most violent affected neighborhoods in Chicago are now getting formalized violence prevention services. Within those neighborhoods, roughly 9 have a comprehensive community outreach programs that are taking place. So 9 police districts are getting those services. And then in 4 or 5 of those police districts, we have a comprehensive job training program that when somebody, the community outreach teams meet someone, they pull them in, they start doing cognitive behavioral therapy with them, they triage social services to try to make their lives a little bit whole, get them thinking about the future, and then they have a job training program. It's roughly a 12 to 18-month program. So what we know is that the model for those programs that New York and LA have implemented have been very effective in driving down their gun violence problems, and that they are also being effective here in Chicago, where the neighborhoods that have that comprehensive approach, and that's 4, we're seeing gun violence down 25 to 30%. Now the difficulty is that we don't have this implemented in a citywide way, and we're just not up to capacity. We're really just kind of beginning the hard work that needs to be done, and it needs a lot more investment.
So now, I think what you're talking about, the spread of activity and the importance of these reductions in violence could be a surprise to viewers. There's certainly striking numbers. Can we talk about what actually happens in one of those 4 communities that you mentioned? What happens that helps bring about that violence reduction?
That's a great question, because that's really the synapse, the important moment that happens when somebody's ready to change your life. And we basically know that there are about 4,000 people between the ages of 16 and 28 in Chicago that are likely to get shot or do the shooting. It's actually the same group because of the networks and the sort of the epidemiology of violence. And those groups are strategically doing outreach to meet those folks wherever they can find them. Sometimes they're checking on old addresses, they're meeting them in hospitals, they're meeting them at crime scenes, they're meeting them in open-air drug markets, they're meeting them on social media, and they're building relationships with them. And that's the key piece of this, is that, and the hardest piece. People that are afraid tend to make really bad decisions, and they don't trust people. So building a trusted relationship with an outreach worker, and then pulling them in and showing them really love, and the love that's necessary for somebody to say, hey, I'm going to take your hand, and Tuesday we've got a meeting with somebody, and this person's going to do some intake with you, and they're going to understand some of the traumas that you faced, and start thinking about what services might be available for you to unpack those traumas and the other things that you need in your life. Stability in food, stability in housing, healthcare, even life coaching, so that you can understand how to interact with people without always resulting to violence.
So can you tell us if you can identify one group that you think is doing this in one of those communities.
Sure.
Some group that's doing a good job, and then
Well,
I'll ask you a question about it.
Sure, fantastic. Well, we're happy to be on the west side here. This isn't quite the Austin neighborhood, but Austin is one of the neighborhoods that in 2016 had skyrocketing gun violence rates. There is a group called the Institute for Nonviolence,
Okay.
which is the Institute for Nonviolent Chicago, which is one of the outreach groups that is part of that ecosystem that is managed by Metropolitan Family Services. They've trained their outreach workers in a consolidated peace academy, and they've got about 65 to 85 outreach workers that are working 24/7, and they're particularly out on those weekend evenings. And they're working very closely with a number of other social service providers, like Catholic Charities, the Build program, which is also a mainstay in the Austin neighborhood. And they're actually finding out on whatever lead, almost the same way that law enforcement would go looking for somebody, just whatever the community, whatever a source, whatever a friend might say where they could find these folks, and then start to build that relationship, and not to force them, but to let them know that they can trust them and they care about their safety. And once those clients or those program participants have a chance to sort of take a breath and let down that fight or flight that many have been experiencing since they were young, they do see behavioral change, and folks are really open to kind of coming off of street life and entering into programs that can help get them right into work.
So you've mentioned that the Institute.
Yes.
With these other agencies working together, will first invite an individual that they believe is at risk of being shot to be part of this social network.
That's right.
They're offering them opportunities for some kinds of counseling or emotional support.
Mm-hmm.
They're offering job opportunities?
Yes.
And how do they do that?
Well, Father Greg Boyle, who runs Homeboy Industry, is
In California?
That's right.
Okay.
Is known for saying nothing stops a bullet like a job, and there is an asterisk to that you have to be job ready. Mm-hmm. And if you're so traumatized, if you are so violence affected, if you have never been given a chance in your life, and in many cases this is the first chance for some of these folks. They really were never given a first chance. They really have to kind of unpack a lot of the other things that they've experienced before they're really ready to be trained for a job. And then those transitional work that it might be with the Safer Foundation, which trains people around maintenance and works very closely with the Chicago Department of Sanitation, and several other organizations that do that kind of work. They help get them ready for it. And in some cases, they even, while these folks are in the transitional employment, they're helping them with other things, like helping them find an apartment, helping them find some rent to stabilize them, dealing with back parking tickets. How do they get to the next job? So really, really basic things. And then thinking about the safety of it, too. If you stepped out of street life, and maybe not everybody else wants you to step out of street life, so being considerate of their safety concerns and how they might have to navigate that.
Maybe even relocate. Huh?
Exactly.
So I'm going to come back in a moment because I know that we have more questions like how do we really know the violence has gone down, and how do our viewers, if they want to refer someone, find it. But first, let me just remind everyone that you are watching Maryville Cares, which is on live CAN TV 21 and on cantv.org/hotline. So we are with Phil Andrew tonight talking about violence prevention. Phil, how do you know violence has gone down?
Well, we've got a lot of good measurements there. The Chicago Police Department, obviously, I see those statistics on a weekly basis. The University of Chicago Crime Lab does some very, very comprehensive studies on particularly when we're looking at gun violence. And so what we've seen is a dip in that in the last 2 years, off that high point that we saw in 2016. But it's difficult to sort of see or feel those statistical change when you're still looking at weekends like we had this summer, where still 50 people are shot, maybe 12 are killed. You know, in this past weekend, I think we had 20 shot and 5 killed. Those are still really unacceptable numbers. And when that's happening still, I don't think it gives anybody the sense that we're making Chicago safer or that we're really turning the corner on this. But I can't emphasize this enough, that these programs are at their genesis, that we've just begun them. What New York and LA did 15 years ago in terms of reforming their police departments, using technology for better policing strategies, even supporting police in terms of their own mental health. You know, we have a terrible problem in Chicago, and not supporting the difficult work that police officers do. We've had record numbers of suicides. So there's a lot that other municipalities implemented years ago that they are reaping the benefit of with their low violence rates that Chicago is just beginning, and in some cases we're still having the conversation about how to do that. But there's kind of 4 elements that will continue to drive those numbers down for us. One is continue to build capacity in the violence prevention work that we're already doing, expanding that beyond the 4, 9, 19 neighborhoods to really make that a citywide strategy. And we have now a formal office of public safety that is going to be implementing that citywide strategy.
And the mayor has named a cabinet member to take that position.
That's right. That's right. And that's a colleague of mine, Susan Lee, who's done a lot of this work. In fact, we've sat at the table with her many times at that violence reduction working group. She's very capable, but she needs the resources to build the capacity for this. The second piece...
But I suppose kudos to Mayor Lightfoot for realizing we need this office to put this in, to manage this process.
Yes. Some of the workings for that were underway under the previous administration, but I think that what we see here is a mayor that really understands this, is deeply committed to this. I think she really understands this problem. The second thing that we need to address is some of the economic development that we need to in some of these disenfranchised areas. The third thing is really addressing the social and emotional concerns of folks that have been for generations traumatized by violence. And the fourth thing is that we've got an illegal gun problem in this area. 40% of the guns that are used in crime in Chicago come from outside the Chicago area. Many of them come from Indiana. And that's going to require better coordination, better enforcement, and some more tools for law enforcement to stop the flow of illegal guns.
Into Illinois.
That's right.
Oh. So you've given us 4 pretty clear directions here. Let me take them one at a time, if we may. So talking about building capacity, what you're saying is, I believe, is that the mayor, with her new department, intends for this to have formal structural support to build capacity in more communities.
Yes.
What are the 4 communities that already have this capacity?
Well, I think that, again, it's at its genesis, but I think that on the west side that we really have a template that's showing great promise and success.
And that's the Austin community?
That's on the Austin community. And through the work by the Institute for Nonviolence and the collaborative of partners that stand with them, the READY program, which is a Heartland Alliance initiative that is that job training program. In addition, Chicago Cred. This is the organization that Arne Duncan, the former Secretary of State, doing very, very similar work, taking people, that are violence affected and within 18 months completely changing their lives. But that requires a lot of counseling, a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of coaching and job training. Those programs are working, but what we're also seeing is happening on the west side is the police commander there, Commander Cato, is doing everything he can to be innovative, to be community-minded, to engage the community. He is really a force to be reckoned with in terms of his community building. Not only is he sort of a decorated police officer that has risen through the ranks, but he's somebody who really, really deeply committed to the community and will engage anybody that raises their hand to do something different in that neighborhood. So he's moving block club by block club, business by business, church by church, building really, really strong relationships. He's even conducted job fairs on street corners. He's really an innovative police commander. So that template of a very engaged commander in a police district that we're triaging resources to, that's going to be the ticket in terms of expanding those programs to other areas. We're beginning this work in Back of the Yards and in Englewood and on the south side, but we're going to have to scaffold together the community connectivity-ness that may or may not exist in other parts of the city.
And the second component you mentioned was about the economic situation?
Yes, well, this is just going to require a lot of very mindful investment in underinvested areas, and that's not an expertise of mine, but I think that we need to encourage companies and the right sort of public policy incentives that make these areas inviting for some investment, and recognizing that there are people there that really do want to work, but they're not in a position to travel for it, or there's some big cultural barriers or some traumatic barriers that have kept them from connecting with that. So we really need to get close to the problem. As Father Greg Boyle would say, there's a proximity issue that you really need to go to the people that are afflicted and bring that help to them. So so that's going to be a critical part, and I think a lot of our great minds in Chicago, and particularly on the corporate side, need to be invited to partner in those initiatives.
And the third part?
The third part, with regard to
This was about
trauma.
social emotional?
Yes, that we just have left unaddressed a lot of trauma, and as you can imagine, in the incident that I was involved in 1988 in Winnetka, I was afforded a lot of great support, and this is even back in '88 where we really didn't have a great understanding of post-traumatic stress,
Right.
or some of the traumatic implications of early violence on a young brain that could completely change the trajectory of its development. So we really need to build the capacity of our mental health capability and then really triage it to the folks that have suffered under violence for a long time. It is very difficult to access psychiatric care in general in Illinois with our social service system, but specifically in these economically devastated areas. Very, very difficult. And there's also some cultural stigma there that folks not recognizing that it's okay to say, hey, I'm hurting and I need some help navigating this. Mm-hmm. And that's going to, again, require building those trusted relationships that you can walk somebody in and say, hey, I think there's help here for you, and we're going to stick with you.
And then the fourth, of course, you mentioned was about illegal guns.
Yes.
And coming into the state of Illinois and being accessed. So if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the things you're saying is that we have a model, it works, there is hope.
Without question. I've never felt more hopeful, but I do know that we've got a lot of hard work to do. Let's say we've got the beachhead, or we've got the 15, 20%, maybe 25% kind of investment and personnel and resources dedicated to this. Now is such an important time for Chicago to really not let up. We've seen this in the past where we've taken on challenges and then we've pulled back, and it's absolutely devastating. You know this at Maryville when the state funds got squeezed, the difficulty for you to maintain your operations, and it really devastates, and it takes yearly, almost a year to kind of gin back up and hire back on the staff and get them certified and trained and have your social workers ready. That it is, we can't let up. We really need to push forward and build on the things that we know are working and really stay very, very focused on those things.
And that's our message. I want to thank you, Phil. And thank you all for watching and participating in this evening's program. I'm Sister Catherine Ryan from Maryville Academy. This evening our guest, our very knowledgeable guest, is Phil Andrew, who's the Director of Violence Prevention Initiatives for the Archdiocese of Chicago. Phil has encouraged us by saying we know how to name the problem, we know how to address the problem, and we know how to tell when it's working. So I thank you, Phil. And if you need more information, you can reach us at Maryville Academy at the phone number on your screen, 312-738-1060. Thank you.